I had just shut off the engine, the smell of gasoline and oil still lingering on my hands and sleeves after a long day at the shop. With just one click of the remote, the garage door began to lift, revealing my spiritual child that I had spent nearly 2 years transforming from a pile of rusted metal into a perfect machine. The sunlight streamed in, glinting off the chrome trim and the deep, lustrous paint that seemed to absorb light like a black hole. Then, suddenly, a piercing scream cut through the air. "That man just stole my car! Call 911 now!" Beverly Lang, my neighbor and HOA president, came charging across the lawn, phone pressed to her ear, mouth spewing accusations, while I still stood on my driveway, keys in hand. The sound of police sirens was already echoing from the end of the street. In just a few minutes, I would be treated like a thief for my property. My name is Ethan Miller, and I'm 32 years old. 6 months ago, I quit my job as an aerospace engineer to open a classic car restoration shop right here in my garage. The centerpiece was a 1968 Shelby GT500 Eleanor that I'd inherited from my father, a former street racing mechanic who passed away when I was 15. Dad had started restoring this beauty, but never got to finish it. For me, completing this car wasn't just about horsepower and chrome. It was about connecting with the old man's memory, finishing what he started. Every bolt I turned, every panel I straightened, felt like having a conversation with him across the years. Beverly Lang was the kind of woman who made homeowners associations infamous. At 45, she sported a perfectly maintained blonde bob and carried her phone like a divine weapon. As both the HOA president and a luxury car broker, she had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial quality control manager. Her favorite pastimes included measuring grass height with a ruler and making my life miserable over what she called commercial activity in a residential zone. The woman had the supernatural ability to appear whenever I started Shelby's engine, clipboard in hand and righteous indignation on her face. "Officers, thank God you're here!" Beverly practically threw herself at the first cop who stepped out of his cruiser. She was waving what looked like an official document, her voice pitched at that special frequency that could shatter wine glasses. "This man has stolen my car. I have the paperwork right here, the bill of sale from my client in Nevada. That's a 1968 Shelby GT500. The way she looked at my car wasn't a casual concern. Her eyes held possessive hunger, usually reserved for something desperately wanted but unattainable. What was stranger was how she rattled off the car's specifications with the precision of someone who'd done their homework, maybe too well. Officer Rodriguez, a stocky guy with tired eyes, approached me with the universal expression of someone dealing with suburban drama instead of actual crime. "Sir, do you mind if we take a look at your documentation for this vehicle?" His partner was already photographing the Shelby while Beverly provided running commentary about serial numbers and engine specifications that frankly impressed me with their accuracy. I handed over my registration, title, and insurance papers, all clearly showing my name and address. But Beverly was ready, producing what she claimed was a bill of sale showing Robert Mitchell from Las Vegas had purchased this exact car from her last week for $75,000. "Mr. Miller," Officer Rodriguez said after examining both documents, "this is unusual. The lady has paperwork showing she sold this car, but your documents show continuous ownership. Can you prove this vehicle has been in your possession for an extended period?" I smiled, because if Beverly wanted to play this game, I was ready to play by my own rules. What she didn't know was that my father had been paranoid about car theft back in his racing days, and this Shelby had more hidden surprises than she could imagine. "Officer, I've got progress photos, restoration videos, and a complete build log, going back 22 months. But more importantly, if you pop the hood, you'll find something interesting carved into the engine block." As we walked toward the car, I caught Beverly shooting a glance toward the sky, following her gaze to what looked like a small drone hovering near the tree line behind my house. Strange, since none of my neighbors were tech hobbyists. Beverly quickly looked away when she noticed me watching, but something about that moment felt off. During our argument, she'd made an odd comment. Harold always said cars like this are incredibly valuable. I had no idea who Harold was, but the way she said it suggested this wasn't just about neighborhood rules or money. There was something bigger going on here, something that made Beverly confident enough to call the police on a lie and expect to win. The officer lifted the hood, and there it was. D. Miller, 1995, etched into the engine block in my father's careful handwriting, along with our old address. Beverly's face went through several interesting color changes as she tried to explain how her Nevada client could have purchased a car with someone else's name permanently carved into the engine. Well, perhaps there's been some confusion, she stammered, but her voice had lost that earlier confidence. Officer Rodriguez looked from Beverly to me and back again, clearly realizing something wasn't right about this situation. "Ma'am, I think we need to see additional documentation about this alleged sale." As Beverly fumbled with her phone, probably trying to contact whoever had helped her fabricate those documents, I noticed something else strange. She knew way too much about my car's technical specifications, details that weren't visible from casual observation and certainly weren't the kind of thing a luxury car broker would memorize about someone else's vehicle. She'd mentioned the 428 Cobra jet engine, the specific gear ratio, even the custom exhaust system I'd installed last month. Either she'd been studying my car very carefully for a very long time, or someone had been feeding her information. Officer Rodriguez closed his notepad and looked at Beverly with the expression of someone who'd realized they'd been called out on a domestic dispute about to become complicated. "Ma'am, I need you to come to the station and clarify some details about this alleged transaction. Mr. Miller, we may need additional documentation, but for now, this appears to be your vehicle." Beverly's face flushed red as she realized her plan had collapsed spectacularly. But as the officers prepared to leave, she played one final card. "Fine, but I'm calling my lawyer and I'm calling Harold Green about this. We'll see how confident Mr. Miller feels when he's dealing with people who understand how these things work." The police left with Beverly's promise to sort out her documentation issues, but I stood in my driveway long after the patrol cars disappeared, staring at that drone still hovering in the distance. Something about this whole situation felt orchestrated, like Beverly had been expecting this confrontation and prepared for it. But she'd also seemed genuinely surprised when her plan fell apart, which made me wonder if she was working with someone who hadn't prepared her well enough. If Beverly Lang thought she could intimidate me into giving up my father's car, she was about to learn that the Miller family doesn't back down from a fight, especially when we're holding all the cards. The next morning, I called Emily before my coffee had even finished brewing. My sister had always been the practical one in the family, which is probably why she chose law school while I was busy getting grease under my fingernails. At 28, Emily was finishing her final year as a law clerk at Patterson and Associates, and while she'd always been skeptical of what she called my expensive hobby, yesterday's events had shifted her perspective. Ethan, what Beverly did yesterday, was completely insane, she said without preamble when she picked up. "I've been thinking about it all night. Most people don't call the police with forged documents unless they're either out of touch with reality or playing a larger, more calculated game. That was when I made what might seem like a strange choice. Instead of arguing to keep the Shelby locked in my own garage, where Beverly could easily keep bothering me, I agreed to let it be impounded at the city's storage facility. Emily thought I'd lost it until I explained. Look, if she's sending fake paperwork and making mysterious calls to this Harold guy, I'll let her believe she's ahead while I figure out what's really happening. What I didn't share with the police was that Dad had installed a hidden backup GPS unit years ago, tucked so deeply into the engine bay that nobody without racing knowledge would ever find it. Before the tow truck hauled the Shelby away, I slipped in a second tracker beneath the rear bumper, designed to look like part of the original hardware. With the car secure inside a city facility with 24/7 surveillance, I did what any engineer does when confronted with a complex system. I began collecting data. Beverly's online activity was a treasure chest. Her Facebook profile was practically a public and revealed a lifestyle far beyond what a suburban HOA president should be able to afford. Luxury handbags, pricey restaurant check-ins, and snapshots from car auctions across 3 different states. Emily helped me dig deeper into public records, where we discovered Beverly's past employment at Green & Associates Real Estate, a firm owned by Harold Green. "Ethan, you need to see this," Emily said one evening, pulling up county records on her laptop. We sat surrounded by sticky notes and printouts, like characters in a low-budget detective drama. Harold isn't just a business contact. He's the chairman of the city council. And according to these records, he's been tied to major property deals for the last 5 years. Even more telling, Beverly had left Green & Associates under what looked like ugly circumstances, right before she took over our HOA. That night, curiosity pulled me back to the gadget Beverly had been eyeing yesterday. It wasn't a hobbyist's drone. Hidden in the bushes along my property line was a tiny listening device, the kind you could buy online for a couple $100. Positioned perfectly, it could capture every conversation in my driveway and garage, explaining how Beverly knew so much about the Shelby's rebuild. She'd been listening in on calls with suppliers, conversations with fellow enthusiasts, and even my talks with Emily. The next morning, things escalated. Beverly posted a 1968 Shelby GT500 for sale across 3 online auction sites, complete with professional-grade photos clearly taken in my garage. She was asking $85,000, nearly double its true value, and advertising it as a fully restored, numbers-matching Eleanor tribute. The brazen part? She was using photos of my car to sell it, betting nobody could connect her scam, Emily's. Legal digging made the picture even darker. Beverly wasn't just behind on her mortgage. She owed almost $200,000, including debts to a company called International Auto Ventures that specialized in shipping vehicles overseas. One stolen Shelby wouldn't fix that mess. It hinted at a broader scheme, and I began wondering how many of our neighbors had already been marked. That night, the tracker I planted on the Shelby sent its first alert. The car was moving. Impossible. At least it should have been, since the impound lot claimed it was locked down. But the GPS ping wasn't from city storage. It was coming from a warehouse district 20 miles out of town. By midnight, the signal had stopped, resting at a facility called Westside Storage Solutions. When I called the impound lot in the morning, they swore my car was still on their premises. That left 2 options. Beverly had the means to either duplicate my car or infiltrate a supposedly secure government facility. Meanwhile, Emily's research was showing Harold Green as a man with enough influence to nudge how police handled property disputes. If Harold was indeed the same Harold Beverly had referenced, then this wasn't just a neighbor's petty scam. It was a racket with political muscle behind it. That evening, Marcus Rodriguez, my quiet, retired neighbor, knocked on my door. Normally reserved, he surprised me by sitting down at my kitchen table and saying, "Ethan, I saw the commotion yesterday. You should know something about Beverly and Harold Green." He explained how Harold had dropped by his house 3 times last year, supposedly being friendly but asking pointed questions about Marcus's vintage motorcycle collection. A week later, Beverly suddenly slapped Marcus with bogus HOA violations. Patterns were forming. This wasn't desperation. It was systematic theft, shielded by political power. As I stared at the Shelby's GPS coordinates on my laptop, the weight of it hit me. Tomorrow would bring either answers or a whole new nightmare. And if Beverly thought she could scare me off, she was about to learn that engineers excel at solving problems, especially when someone threatens the things we value most. The following day, Emily arrived carrying a box of Dad's old files from the attic. "Something about Harold's name stuck in my head," she said, dumping the papers across the table. Buried in a 1995 company newsletter was a group photo from Dad's aerospace firm. Standing beside him, younger but unmistakable, was Harold. Green, Smiling stiffly, labeled as the newly promoted quality assurance manager, Marcus, with his 40 years of PI experience, agreed to teach us how to tail someone unnoticed. "Patience," he said as we parked near Beverly's place at 6 in the morning. "People like her have routines, and routines create openings." Sure enough, at 7:30 sharp, Beverly drove her white BMW straight toward the warehouse district. The sign read West Side Storage Solutions, but the yard looked more like a staging ground for stolen classics. Through the fence, we spotted at least a dozen high-value vehicles. A '67 Mustang that looked like Mrs. Patterson's, a vintage Harley matching Marcus's missing bike, and, under a tarp in the corner, my Shelby. "This isn't just about you," Marcus muttered while snapping photos with a telephoto lens. "This is a coordinated operation stripping the neighborhood." Emily's deeper dive into Harold's firm showed even uglier truths. Green & Associates specialized in estate liquidations, but the pattern revealed elderly homeowners selling prized possessions at suspiciously low prices, often within months of receiving new HOA citations from Beverly. Jake Thompson, the neighborhood electrician, added another piece. Nervously, he recalled Beverly hiring him to install cameras around common areas. Only the equipment wasn't standard. It was military-grade surveillance gear. Jake had refused but kept the specs, which Emily confirmed could track vehicles and capture conversations at long range. The final piece came from Mrs. Patterson, who phoned me that afternoon with news that pulled the entire scheme into focus. The widow, 85 years old, had spent months locked in a battle with the HOA over supposed violations involving her vintage piano, a treasured Steinway Model M from 1924 that had once belonged to her late husband. "But here's the strange part, dear," she whispered in her frail, trembling voice. "Harold Green came by 3 different times last month, asking questions about that piano. Not just casual questions, either. He knew it was a 1924 Steinway Model M, knew the custom modifications my husband had added, and even pressed me about the original purchase records. How could he possibly know all that unless he'd been digging into it?" The pattern was undeniable. Harold would research valuable possessions. Beverly would apply HOA pressure. Then, as if on cue, Harold's company would arrive with a solution. Emily's legal digging unearthed the smoking gun. Beverly's financial troubles weren't simple personal debt. They were tangled in an intricate web of loans and business ties, all flowing back to Harold Green's companies. "She isn't just working for him," Emily explained, sliding corporate filings across the table. "She's a minority partner in 3 of Harold's businesses. She's financially tethered to him, which means even if she wanted to stop, she can't." Bank statements told the rest of the story. Beverly had been funneling regular payments to something called International Auto Ventures for a year and a half. That very night, the GPS tracker on my Shelby lit up again. This time, the signal moved toward the shipping district, straight, to a facility notorious for handling overseas container traffic. Emily and I tailed it carefully, watching from the shadows as Beverly personally oversaw what looked like my car being loaded onto a truck bound for the port. "We need to call Agent Rebecca Taylor with Customs Enforcement," Emily urged, already dialing a number she had researched earlier. "If they're preparing to ship stolen vehicles overseas, it becomes a federal crime. That means we can stop this before your car disappears for good." As the truck pulled away, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice that answered was calm, deliberate, and chillingly assured. "Hello, Ethan. This is Harold Green. I think it's time we finally discussed your father and some unfinished business from long ago." Then the line went dead. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't about a stolen car anymore. This had roots buried 30 years deep. That call shook me more than I cared to admit, yet it confirmed a suspicion I'd carried ever since I'd found that old company photo. This wasn't just theft. It was personal. And it had been personal for decades. I spent the rest of the night combing through Dad's files, searching for any link to Harold Green. The answer came in a worn manila envelope labeled Insurance. Claims. 1995. My blood ran cold. Inside were copies of safety reports Dad had filed on defective aircraft components. Each report had been flagged for review. Each had been signed off by Harold Green. By dawn, Emily had returned with Agent Rebecca Taylor. Sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, Taylor looked more suited to chasing drug cartels than suburban HOA fraud. "Mr. Miller, your sister has brought me up to speed," she said, spreading surveillance photos across my kitchen table. "What you've described matches a pattern we've been tracking for 6 months. At least 3 other states have seen nearly identical operations, local officials exploiting their authority to funnel valuable property into overseas markets. The images showed shipping containers, warehouses, and paperwork that mirrored Beverly's operation exactly. The tracker on my Shelby still pinged from the port, but Taylor warned we couldn't rush in. Without airtight warrants, Harold's political clout could get everything thrown out. But if we can catch the transfer of stolen property in real time while it's entering international shipping, then we have him. Even his lawyers can't bury that. The plan was deceptively simple. Let them think they were winning, while we built an unshakable case. That night, sitting in my garage, surrounded by the tools meant for the Shelby's restoration, I couldn't stop thinking of Dad. The car wasn't just metal and chrome. It was the last thread tying me to him and to the lessons he left behind. Craftsmanship matters, integrity matters, and you don't let predators take what's yours. At 5:47 a.m., the sting operation erupted into chaos. Federal agents, port. Security and local police swarmed container BVLG 2024 from 3 directions. My Shelby was caught mid-transfer, the centerpiece in what Taylor later called the largest interstate property theft ring we've ever dismantled. Beverly was caught holding shipping manifests that listed not only my Shelby but 8 other classics stolen across 3 states. Her collapse was instant, the HOA tyrant reduced to a sobbing wreck on the dock. "I didn't want to do this," she cried as Taylor read her rights. "Harold made me. He said if I didn't help, he'd ruin me. He has files on everyone. You don't know what he's capable of." Inside the containers, we found far more than stolen cars. Mrs. Patterson's 1924 Steinway piano, Marcus's vintage Harley-Davidson, Jake Thompson's father's rare watch collection, each artifact wrapped, cataloged, and tagged for export. "This isn't just theft," Taylor muttered grimly, snapping photos. "This is cultural heritage trafficking. They're stripping communities bare." Beverly's confession confirmed it all. Harold had built a machine, researched the families, pressure them with HOA violations, then seize their treasures for profit. 15 neighborhoods, 15 different local officials, each compromised, each controlled, and at the center of it all, Harold Green. The Shelby was finally recovered, 2 years of restoration intact, but the truth was out in the open. Harold's empire had been built on blackmail, coercion, and the ruthless exploitation of trust. And now, for the first time, it was beginning to crumble. Harold's crew knew exactly what they were handling, and they had treated the vehicle with expert precision. Yet watching it bundled up and crated like some retail shipment gave me a sudden clarity about how Mrs. Patterson must have felt regarding her late husband's piano. These objects weren't simply valuables to their owners. They were pieces of their lives, anchors to memory, fragments of love, history that no sum of money could ever buy back. Beverly's live broadcast from inside the shipping container, streamed to her 847 Facebook followers, turned into an accidental confession that caught fire online within hours. Viewers watched her unravel in real time, complete with her own words admitting to federal agents that she had been Harold Green's accomplice in looting my neighbors for 3 years. The comment section erupted. Survivors of similar scams across the country chimed in. One user wrote, "This happened to my grandmother in Phoenix. She lost her husband's vintage guitars to a man exactly like Harold Green." The video racked up more than 50,000 shares in its first 6 hours, And before long, Beverly had unwillingly become the new face of suburban victimhood. Green himself showed up at the port just as Beverly was being ushered into a federal transport van. Unlike Beverly's collapse, Harold exuded confidence, stepping from his polished black sedan as though his political ties could shield him from accountability. Agent Taylor intercepted him halfway across the lot. I couldn't hear their exchange, but Harold's shifting posture revealed the truth. His shoulders slumped when shown photographs from inside the container, and his lawyer's bravado withered once Taylor produced the federal arrest warrant. Shh. Harold was being processed. Agent Taylor beckoned me over. "Mr. Miller, Green has asked to speak to you privately before transport. You're not required to agree, but he insists he has information about your father that you'll want to hear." Face to face with Harold Green for the very first time, I was startled by how unremarkable he looked. This man who had terrorized my neighborhood and stripped families of their heirlooms could have passed for any other 60-year-old businessman in an overpriced suit. Yet his eyes, steady, calculating, made my skin crawl. "Your father discovered something about me 3 decades ago that could have ended my career," Harold said, his voice unnervingly calm despite the cuffs. "But before he could ruin me, he died in that convenient racing accident. And do you know what I found among his things? Proof that he wasn't some noble whistleblower. He was planning to blackmail me, the same way I've blackmailed others all these years." Then Harold smiled, a smile so cold it looked inhuman. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Ethan. Your father was just like me. He simply got caught before he could cash in." The accusation struck like a punch to the chest. Before I could speak, Agent Taylor cut in sharply. "Mr. Green, you have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it. Anything else you say will be evidence against you in federal court." But Harold wasn't finished twisting the knife. As agents escorted him toward the transport vehicle, he glanced back with that same icy grin. "Ask your sister about the safety deposit box, Ethan. Ask her what your father left behind." The words landed like a seed of doubt, and I noticed Emily pale beside me. The ride back to my house was thick with silence, each of us lost in thought. Beverly now faced a mountain of federal charges: racketeering, conspiracy, and interstate theft, while Harold's arrest sparked coordinated raids in 15 cities. Agent Taylor estimated the total recovery of stolen property could surpass $50 million. Yet Harold's final hint about Dad wouldn't stop echoing in my mind. When I asked Emily, she admitted she had once found a mysterious key among Dad's belongings, but never followed up on what it opened. That revelation clung to me as tightly as Harold's smirk. Meanwhile, Beverly's desperate attempts to salvage her reputation from inside federal custody offered us a twisted form of comic relief. Her daughter had smuggled her a phone, and she was back to live streaming, this time from a detention cell. The connection was abysmal. Her voice warped like a glitching robot as she declared, "My dear friends, Izoot completely innocent. Harold Green is the real bees at Criminal Mastermind." The comments were merciless. "Lady, you confessed on live TV this morning," one wrote. Another posted, "Karen.exe has stopped working." The climax came when Beverly tried to display a handwritten sign reading Harold Jucker Mastermind. With the lagging frame rate, it looked like she was waving a scrap of paper while babbling nonsense. Amid that farce, Agent Taylor phoned with updates. "Ethan, what we found in Harold's office is going to blow this case open. He kept meticulous files, victim profiles, financial breakdowns, psychological assessments, even recordings. It's practically a manual for organized theft, and we've recovered his blackmail files, the leverage he used to control his network." That day, Emily returned from the bank carrying a manila envelope from Dad's safety deposit box. Inside were damning safety reports exposing Harold's approval of faulty aircraft parts, documents Dad had never withdrawn. But there was more. An old cassette tape containing Harold's voice, unmistakable, threatening Dad's life if he refused to bury the reports. "Accidents happen to people who don't know when to keep quiet," Harold's 30-year-old voice snarled. Alongside it lay a letter Dad had drafted for the FBI, unsent but heartbreaking. If something happens to me, know that I tried to do the right thing, even when it became dangerous. The final lines crushed me. I will not abandon my family. If I die under suspicious circumstances, know Harold Green is behind it. I've gathered this evidence so my son can grow up in a world where men like him face consequences. Dad hadn't been plotting blackmail, he'd been fighting for justice just as we were doing now. At that very moment, Beverly's improved internet connection turned her live stream into a new spectacle. Crystal clear audio echoed from what looked like a detention center bathroom. "Harold Green has files on everyone!" she screamed. "Your affairs, your debts, your secrets!" The live chat lit up with a flood of ridicule. "Ma'am, this is a Wendy's," one user posted, racking up hundreds of likes. Her accidental comedy routine ended when she flipped to her front camera and delivered a 30-second rant to her own reflection. By then, Agent Taylor had summoned us to the federal building where Harold's facade finally began to break. The cassette tape was played, the letter displayed, and with that evidence, his lawyer had no choice but to start plea negotiations. My client is prepared to provide full cooperation with federal authorities in exchange for consideration in sentencing, the lawyer announced. But Harold himself looked like a man who had just realized that 30 years of careful planning had been undone by evidence he never even knew existed. "How long have you had that recording?" he asked me directly, ignoring his lawyer's advice to remain silent. "Since the day my father died," I replied, which wasn't technically true, but felt emotionally accurate. He knew exactly what kind of person Harold was, and he made sure the truth would eventually come out. That was when Harold's composure finally shattered completely. The man who had terrorized 15 neighborhoods, stolen millions of dollars in personal property, and destroyed countless families' treasured memories, broke down crying in a federal interrogation room. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he sobbed. It was probably the first honest thing he'd said in decades. It started small, just a few items here and there, people who wouldn't miss them. But then it became easier, more profitable, and I couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Beverly's live stream reached its absolute peak of unintentional comedy when she apparently tried to end the broadcast, but instead accidentally started a new one. This time, she was clearly in a different location, possibly a holding cell, and she was talking to someone off camera who was unmistakably a federal agent. "What do you mean I can't get bail?" she demanded, apparently unaware that hundreds of people were watching. "I cooperated. I told you everything about Harold. I even gave you the spreadsheets." The agent's patient voice could be heard explaining that interstate trafficking charges typically don't qualify for bail. But Beverly kept interrupting with increasingly desperate arguments. "But I have a dentist appointment on Thursday, and my book club meets on Friday. You can't just keep me here indefinitely." The comment section was having a field day. One particularly popular remark read, "Karen wants to speak to the federal manager." As we left the federal building that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this entire ordeal began: genuine peace. Harold Green was facing federal charges that would almost certainly result in a life sentence. Beverly would serve significant prison time but had avoided the harshest penalties through her cooperation. Most importantly, Dad's reputation was not only intact but enhanced. He had died trying to stop the very crimes that had just been exposed 30 years later. The Shelby was mine again, legally and morally. Harold's network of corruption had been dismantled across 3 states, but the real victory was simpler. Truth had finally triumphed over lies, and justice had proven that it's never too late to arrive. 1 year later, I stood in my garage on a crisp Saturday morning, watching sunlight stream through the open door and dance across Eleanor's pristine chrome. The past 12 months had brought changes I never could have imagined. When Beverly first called the police on me for stealing my own car, the federal case against Harold Green had concluded with a life sentence without parole, making him one of the oldest defendants ever convicted under federal racketeering statutes. Beverly had received 7 years in federal prison, though she would likely serve less with good behavior and continued cooperation. More importantly, the victims of their scheme had recovered property worth over $47 million, and 15 different communities had dismantled their corrupt HOA systems in favor of transparent, democratically elected neighborhood councils. Emily had passed the bar exam and immediately opened her practice, specializing in property rights and elder abuse cases. Her first major client was Mrs. Patterson, who had successfully sued Harold's estate for emotional distress and used the settlement to establish a foundation that supported elderly victims of financial fraud. "I never thought I'd say this," Emily told me while reviewing case files at my kitchen table. "But watching you fight for that car taught me something important about what really matters. It's not about the money or the objects themselves. It's about standing up to people who think they can take whatever they want just because they have power." Her practice was booming, fueled mostly by referrals from other victims of similar schemes that had been exposed after Harold's arrest. Marcus Rodriguez had been elected the first president of our new neighborhood council, a position he approached with the methodical thoroughness of a career investigator. His first official act was to establish a property protection protocol that required any complaints about residents' belongings to be reviewed by a 3-person committee, and to include a mandatory cooling-off period before any action could be taken. "The goal is to make sure that nobody can ever again use bureaucratic pressure to target their neighbors," he explained during a community meeting that drew over 200 residents from surrounding neighborhoods. Marcus had also started a small consulting business helping other communities reform their HOA systems. Jake Thompson used his settlement money from Harold's restitution fund to start Thompson Security Solutions, a company specializing in protecting valuable personal property for collectors and enthusiasts. His first major contract was with a vintage car club that had been targeted by copycat criminals inspired by news coverage of Harold's operation. "The best part about this business," Jake told me while installing a state-of-the-art security system in my garage, "is that I get to help people protect the things they love instead of worrying about who's trying to steal them." His company had expanded to 4 full-time employees and was even considering opening a second location. Mrs. Patterson had become something of a celebrity advocate for victims' rights, traveling to speaking engagements across 3 states and testifying before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections against organized property theft. Her 1924 Steinway piano, painstakingly restored at Harold's expense, now stood as the centerpiece of a music therapy program she had founded at the local senior center. "Harold believed he could steal my memories along with my husband's piano," she told viewers in a televised interview that aired on the anniversary of the arrests. "But what he never understood is that memories can't be crated up and shipped overseas. They live right here." She tapped her chest. "And no one can ever take them away." Meanwhile, Agent Rebecca Taylor had risen to become head of the newly created Federal Property Crimes Task Force, a specialized unit designed to dismantle organized theft operations like Harold's. In its first year alone, the task force disrupted a dozen major schemes across 8 states, recovering over $200 million in stolen assets and arresting 47 suspects. "The Harold Green case showed us that property crime isn't just about lone thieves," Taylor explained at a press conference. "It's about organized networks that exploit legitimate institutions, government offices, housing authorities, homeowner associations to mask systematic theft." Their success was so significant that it triggered congressional hearings on federal oversight of local housing bodies. Eleanor herself became a kind of landmark, displayed at car shows and community gatherings as a symbol of justice and perseverance. I had finished Dad's restoration exactly as he'd outlined in his notes, following every sketch and detail. On the dashboard gleamed a small brass plaque, "In memory of David Miller, a man who chose truth over safety. Yet Eleanor represented more than his dream. It became the foundation of mine. With funds from the Federal Restitution Fund and donations from supporters, I launched the David Miller Technical Training Center, a nonprofit teaching automotive and aerospace skills to young people from low-income families. Housed in a city-donated warehouse, it featured 4 working bays, a full machine shop, and classrooms for 30 students. Our very first graduating class of 12 all secured jobs in local automotive and aerospace firms, starting at an average of $18 an hour. "Your father would be so proud," Emily told me as we watched the next class tear into their first engine rebuild. He always believed integrity and skill were the greatest gifts you could give young people. The center now had a waiting list of over 100 applicants and interest from communities hoping to replicate the model. Harold's final attempt at manipulation collapsed spectacularly. His secret insurance, a USB drive, contained not only evidence of his own schemes, but also recordings that implicated 6 local officials in corruption: a county commissioner, 2 city planners, and 3 HOA board members. Harold thought he was clever keeping those files to shield himself, Agent Taylor told me in our final debrief. But criminals all make the same mistake. They assume everyone's corrupt, so they never imagine honest people will use their own evidence against them. The community that had nearly been destroyed by Harold's operation was now stronger than ever. Property values rose as buyers sought neighborhoods with transparent governance and united residents. Each summer, we hosted the Harold Green Memorial Car Show, a regional attraction that drew vintage car enthusiasts and raised funds for victim assistance programs. The name was ironic, since Harold remained very much alive in federal prison, but nobody suggested changing it. The event had become too powerful a symbol of resilience. That morning, as I closed the garage and prepared to drive Eleanor to our monthly cars and coffee meet, I thought about how far we had come since my first clash with Beverly. Harold had tried to rob us of our treasures and fracture our trust, but in the end, his crimes bound us together more tightly than simple neighborly goodwill ever could. The Shelby's engine purred with the exact note my father intended. Yet, now it carried the voices of an entire community that had learned to defend itself. Sometimes justice strikes quickly. Other times it takes decades. But the lesson I learned is that it always arrives, so long as good people refuse to stop fighting. So let me ask you, what would you have done if your neighbor dialed 911 claiming you'd stolen your own car? Would you have resisted like Ethan, or caved to the pressure? This story proves that justice isn't always immediate, but it is always worth the fight. And if tales of suburban corruption, family legacy, and truth's triumph over lies kept you hooked, hit that subscribe button for more stories where justice always finds a way.